My dad ranked all 5 of his kids by who made him proudest at his 60th birthday dinner. So we ranked his best moments as a father. It was my dad's 60th birthday at Morton's Steakhouse, and all 5 of us kids were there with our families. Dad stood up before dessert and pulled out a leather folder. He said, "I'm going to rank my 5 children by who made me proudest, and nobody interrupts until I'm done talking." He opened the folder and said, "Number 5, my biggest disappointment is my youngest son." He pulled out printed screenshots of my brother Ben's Instagram and started reading his posts out loud. Posts about mental health, posts about therapy, posts about breaking generational trauma. Dad said, "You air our family's dirty laundry to strangers for attention, and you wonder why I don't respect you." Ben said, "Dad, that's my personal account." But Dad held up his hand and said, "Sit there and think about the last time you made me feel anything other than embarrassed." My older sister Claire reached across the table and squeezed Ben's shoulder. Dad said, "Number 4 is my oldest daughter." Claire straightened in her chair. Dad pulled out his phone and started listing every job she'd quit in the last 6 years, with exact start and end dates. He said, "You're 34 years old, and you still don't know what you want to be when you grow up." Claire said, "I've been building my career." Dad laughed and said, "You've been building excuses." Then he said, "But I'm sure your latest life coach told you that's okay." I pulled out my phone under the table and texted the sibling group chat. "How does he know about her life coach?" My phone buzzed twice. Then Dad folded his hands and said, "I also know about the little meeting you all had last month where you discussed not inviting me to future holidays." I looked up from my phone and watched my siblings' faces change. My youngest sister Maya knocked her wine glass, and red wine spread across the white tablecloth. Dad said, "Number 3 is Maya." He looked at her and said, "I'm so sorry you married someone who makes less money than a high school teacher and convinced you that love is more important than stability." Maya's husband's jaw clenched. Dad continued, "But I heard you crying to your mother last month about your credit card debt, so maybe you're starting to see what I've been saying all along." Maya whispered, "I never told Mom that," and Dad smiled. I looked at my youngest sister, and her hands were shaking as she stared at her plate. I said her name and she wouldn't look up. Dad said, "Number 2 is you." He pointed at me. "You had so much potential, and you settled for middle management and a mortgage you can barely afford. You told your wife 3 weeks ago that you felt like you were failing at everything. Those were your exact words." I'd had that conversation at 11 p.m. in our bedroom with the door closed. I said, "How do you—" But Dad interrupted. "Number 1, my pride and joy is my youngest daughter because she's the only one who understands that family means honoring your father." He looked directly at her and said, "Isn't that right?" My youngest sister looked up with tears running down her face and said, "Dad, please stop." I stood up and said, "Now it's our turn to rank something. We're going to rank your best moments as a father, from 5 to 1. Dad said, "Sit down before you humiliate yourself," but I kept going. "Number 5 is the time you showed up to Ben's college graduation, even though you told everyone in the car that liberal arts degrees are for people who can't do real work." Ben stood up and said, "I didn't speak to you for 6 months after that day." Claire stood up and said, "Number 4 is my wedding day when you told me during the father-daughter dance that I was making the biggest mistake of my life." Dad said, "I was trying to protect you." Claire said, "I got divorced 2 years later and never called you." Maya stood up and said, "Number 3 is when I had a miscarriage, and you said maybe it was for the best since we couldn't afford kids anyway." Dad's face went pale. I said, "Number 2 is every single time you told me that disappointment was your dominant emotion when you looked at me." Dad stood up and said, "I have sacrificed everything for you kids. I worked 60-hour weeks so you could have opportunities. And this is how you thank me?" He turned to my youngest sister and said, Tell them what I've done for you." My youngest sister stood up slowly. She said, "Number 1, your best moment as a father was when you had COVID for 2 weeks and couldn't leave your room." Dad's mouth opened, but nothing came out. My youngest sister looked Dad directly in the eyes and said, "I volunteered to drop off your groceries because it meant you couldn't talk, and I would have done anything to keep you quiet." She wiped her tears and said, "Save it for the eulogy. None of us are planning to give one."